Hello everyone. Today's video is about critical evaluation in action. We've looked at the idea of the CRAAP acronym and how it can be used to help your reading and your analysis of all of the sources that you're going to be using in your EPQ report. Now, what we're going to do is look very closely at how students have done that. But before I do that, I want to remind you of the importance of Project Q, the production log, and in particular, we're at the stage of the planning review. As you know, you've done your Gantt charts, or you've used Notion, or you've used a calendar to have your entire project planned. At this particular stage now, you should also be filling in your Project Q in a lot of detail, explaining exactly how and why you've chosen the methods that you have. You will very soon be moving on to the mid-project review. And this is really important because at this point, the title will be locked. So you now have 4 weeks to decide your title. And at this particular time, you should be reading absolutely intensely and beginning to plan and to think about how your report or artifact is going to manifest. So it's very important that you now decide any tweaking or changes to the question. And the reason why we're doing the critical evaluation of sources now is to remind you that you need the information before you start planning and before we lock in this title over here. Now, as I said, today we're going to be looking at extracts from student EPQ reports. I'm going to give you a little bit of background and explain why the importance of the title, and we will see how these students use the critical evaluation from their tables and that they put it into their reports. I just want to remind you that in terms of AO2, this is your use of sources. The critical selection and evaluation of a wide range of sources is absolutely key. And this will be key to the whole project. So in your report, you must be looking for occasions where you interrogate the source, you show some of its defects, or you show why it's good and why it's strong. Now, I just remind you very quickly in terms of the CRAAP acronym, we have the currency, relevance, authority, accuracy, and purpose. This is one means of doing critical evaluation. Another that we looked at was RAVEN, reputation, ability to see, vested interest, that can be a very important one, expertise, which is very similar to authority, and neutrality. So that's a different variation. And the third one we looked at is NOPTC, where you look at nature, origin, and purpose. But you could also include things like tone and context. And context will be important, or one of the two of the reports that we look at today. Just a reminder, in terms of challenging, you can challenge the currency, you can challenge the reliability, you can question the relevance of the research, you can question the data collection methods, or the sample size, or whether the data is selective. I highly recommend Ben Goldacre on YouTube, who is a scientist from pharma who shows how often scientific and pharma studies are highly selective. You can also point out the lack of peer review. You can challenge the specialism. You can talk about bias and funding. You can find alternative and rival studies, particularly studies which use meta-analysis that I'm going to talk about today. You can use one critic against another. You can reveal a history of ideological, political bias or having a special agenda. You could talk about confirmation bias, where people see what they want to. If you're doing history, you can draw upon revisionist accounts, new accounts of history which challenge the traditional accounts. As I said, meta-analysis will be absolutely key, especially to quantitative studies. And questioning statistics, data collection methods, revealing flaws in reasoning, conclusions, and also things like logical fallacies, the straw man fallacy, and the slippery slope fallacy. I've made a video. And now we'll move on to looking at some student reports and look at a whole variety of ways in which they've chosen to show critical evaluation in action. I hope you find these very useful. Okay, so I think I'm going to start off this recording of critical evaluation in action with an excellent EPQ, which is on the subject of, is sugar a drug? Okay. Now, just to remind you, these are real examples of students showing critical evaluation techniques in their reports. They're not perfect, but they'll give you some ideas, I hope, okay? Beginning with this one then, is sugar a drug? We see that this particular student looks at RIP and Angelopoulos, difficult to pronounce, 2016, with the page number there, so very well referenced. And he says, their research continuously disproves any association between sugar and obesity, stating neither the end that data related to added sugar intake as a potential significant contributor to obesity must be treated with great caution. So the findings from this study are very clear. There is no link between sugar and obesity. Does sound very suspicious, doesn't it? Look what he shows. Interestingly, Rip and Angelopoulos admitted in their conflict of interest section that they'd received unrestricted grants from our old friends Pepsi Cola and Coca-Cola, to name but a few. So it's very interesting. One of the key things to show vested interest, to show bias in studies, as I've said before, is to follow the money. Now, if you are doing the RAVEN acronym for critical analysis, you've got the V in there, which stands for vested interest. If you're doing the CRAAP style analysis, I guess you would question the reliability and the authority, perhaps, of the study, or even the purpose. Because in this particular case, if the funding has been provided by Pepsi Cola and we find that there's no link whatsoever between obesity and drinking gallons of soda, then it seems extremely suspicious. So this is a very good example of a student who's done some detective work and has found that there is often the research is sponsored by the sugar industry. And that, of course, calls into question the credibility, the objectivity of this source. Now, this would equally apply to studies on oil, on climate change, petrochemicals, and of course our friends Big Pharma, who will often commission studies that are extremely biased. And I suggest that all of you are doing medical style EPQs, look at the work of Ben Goldacre, Fake Pharma or Bad Science. Excellent study. Now I'm going to move on to a very different type of study, which is the psychological effects of adoption. And this particular student shows, even with the ongoing studies and studies being reevaluated, it has been very difficult to come to any conclusion about whether or not adopted children are more at risk of psychological problems. So this student is looking at the idea of children who are adopted, who are not with their biological parents, do they develop more psychological problems or not? And here he says, Brodzinski reanalyzed data from a study in 1984. Now, this is really important because this is peer review. And we've said before that it's absolutely crucial that you look, especially in science and psychology style studies, to see if people have actually redone the entire experiment. This is part of this idea of meta-analysis, isn't it, that shows the credibility. And in this case, and why I'm choosing this as an example, is this student goes really deep into the nature of the sample itself. He says it's drawn from a mixture of boys and girls aged 6 to 11, and the data was taken from ratings on child adjustment to households in regards to the Asian-Bucks child behavior profile. So he's been extremely specific at looking at the criteria that is used in this particular study, okay? The findings of the reanalyzed data showed that the adopted children in the clinical samples were more likely to develop personality disorders. So it sounds like the data is on the side of the argument that children who adopt it are going to develop more personality disorders, such as ADD, as he says. But this is good. However, he shows us here, the non-clinical sample showed less stable, less conclusive data. Now, this is fantastic in terms of using one study against another study. And this shows that these studies can be interrogated and questioned. This is an excellent example of critical evaluation in action. So the non-clinical sample shows that they're less stable, less conclusive. If you do A-level psychology, or if you do GCSE psychology, you will remember that this comes under the idea of ecological validity. So things that work lovely in the lab, what happens when we look at them out in terms of the community? And why I think this is such an excellent EPQ is this student goes on to look at the flaws in the study. One potential could stem, notice he says could, doesn't say it is necessarily, but he's speculating. And he calls this, he talks about it, they've analyzed the data in terms of the group mean comparison. And he goes on to talk about why this might be a problem. So one of the things I want you to remember is that quantitative data often presents itself as being objective. But we can actually interrogate quantitative data. We can look at how it's put together. We can see whether there was any bias or sample selection errors like this student does. And so this is an excellent example of really digging deep into the study, showing evaluative skills that are the top skills in AO2 in terms of the EPQ. There's only one rather sad thing. As the student finishes, he goes on to say, I do not believe that adopted children show higher risk levels. It just seemed unfortunate, as I say here, because this move into the personal seems rather unscientific. And it would be much better, in my opinion, to keep this in the third person and to say, therefore, the data shows that. That would make it less personal. Now, I'm going to put this particular paragraph in because it's more of a humanities style report. So it's within the sort of politics stroke history paradigm. It's very interesting. It's on prison labor in the United States and how it could be seen as slave labor. Now, what I like about this immediately is it shows careful reading of the study, that she has specific figures, $36,000 there per prisoner, and this results in 5.8 billion. She notices and she says it's a fair argument that it's expensive for prisoners. So she's not only criticizing the study, she's kind of agreeing with it as well. But notice here, she says, however, these statistics are from the most recent available data from the Bureau of Justice, and it's only 2005. We are now in 2023. So in terms of the CRAAP acronym, she is questioning the currency. And the fact that this data is so out of date also questions the authority of the data. So it's a very good example there of looking at dates carefully. Secondly, she uses comparative studies, which is often an excellent way of challenging criticism. The argument that low wages for prisoners is to reduce the upkeep of costs can be challenged by comparing the United States penal labor system to Australia. And what does she find? She says, Australian prisoners cost taxpayers $3.34 billion, whereas American prisons cost $80 billion. And as she says here, this is a massive discrepancy. So putting these two sets of statistics together questions the argument above, that the United States is getting good value for taxpayers' money. And that challenges the authority and the credibility of that argument. So I think that that's an excellent example within the history humanities paradigm of how to question sources. Okay, moving on to a different type of EPQ. This one is very interesting. It looks at the connection between stress and diabetes. And it's got some excellent critical evaluation of sources. It says, either way, there's evidence to support the notion that depression worsens glycemic control. It finds a really good study here to back it up, and it points out that this is a meta-analysis. I want to just emphasize how important meta-analysis is, because it looks at various studies in this particular field, and therefore it can get past what we call outliers. Outliers are where we have like a study and it's a single study and it comes out with a very radical conclusion. Meta-analysis usually has a lot more credibility. It's very good in terms of critical evaluation because it tends to have a lot of authority, okay? Notice the studies used here. There's a good quote here, so it shows that the study's been read carefully. There's a study from the Harvard Medical School. Obviously, it's going to be one of the greatest in the world. And there's another study here to back it. It's often very good to show that these studies were done by quite distant dates. That's 2001, and this one's 2013. It points out that it's from a very reputable medical journal and that it's a meta-analysis, and that there's evidence from other academic papers. All of this adds credibility to it, okay? It says, although studied in 2001, it shows that this has been repeated later. Notice here it has Groot et al. Then it says another meta-analysis by these two researchers here found that depression increased mortality among diabetic patients. This finding was an all-cause mortality, so although it does not specifically indicate depression, it does suggest an adverse effect on their health. So it's a very nuanced approach, which looks at the nature of the studies, it looks for patterns of data, and I think it really helps and gives a really good impression that this student has evaluated this study and seen whether it's consistent with other studies. Now I'm just going to move on to a very different TPQ. This is a report that was based on a school in a British curriculum school in the Middle East, and it was asking the question is Anglocentrism, looking at a curriculum mainly from a British view, is it harmful in a British international school? And the paragraph I'm going to look at is Michael Gove, who used to be the British Education Secretary. She points out that he is a cultural restorationist. In other words, he really wants to save British culture. Now, rather than just attacking him straight away, she says that cultural heritage education may be perceived as positive in terms of deepening a student's connection with local history. But what she says is this particular idea that education should make you patriotic, is it relevant within an international school within the Middle East? So this is a very good example of taking a point of view, seeing that it has some kind of credibility, but in a different context, she shows that it doesn't have nearly as much relevance. She points out here, moreover, Gove wanted schools to promote patriotism by putting British history at the heart of the national curriculum. Once again, she points out that this idea of patriotism, this ideology of patriotism, may be valid in the UK. She doesn't say it is, but she says it may be. But she says in the context of a British school in the Middle East, it will not aid in increasing the awareness of the local environment. Now, I think that that's an excellent example of looking at an argument and evaluating whether it is relevant within this context. So in terms of the CRAAP formula, I would say that we're looking at the R there, the relevance idea. Just want to say one more thing about this. Having considered these counter-arguments, this paper will move swiftly on to discuss why Anglocentrism in British schools in the Middle East is problematic. Very nice transition here. So I just want to remind you, in a long report, it's very good to signpost the structure and to tell the reader what you're moving on to and to provide little mini conclusions that show what that section did in terms of answering this research question. Now, I hope that that was useful. There's some excellent examples of critical evaluation. You now have to aim to get the information from your own critical evaluation tables into your reports. Thank you for listening.